That was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes. Hello again. So, my name is Suzanne Wadi. I forgot to introduce myself, by the way. And I'll be reading an excerpt from Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri Luzumiyat, a collection of Arabic language poems which discuss many aspects of al-Ma'arri's philosophy on life. Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri was born in 973 CE in Ma'arra, modern-day Syria, and is considered one of the greatest Arab poets of all time. He ate animal products just twice a year on the two Islamic Eid festivals, otherwise leading a vegan life. Imagine that. He refrained even from clothing made from animal skin, approximately 1,000 years prior to Donald Watson inventing the term veganism in 1944. This excerpt has been translated by freelance journalist Nick McAlpin from London, who has recently published an article about vegan washing the Israeli occupation of Palestine. The hope with this short yet powerful excerpt is to serve as a reminder of a time before consumerism, a time where animals were valued and cherished rather than exploited for the selfish gratification of humans. I'm hopeful that this piece will resonate with you all as it did with me. I'll be reading it in Arabic, but the English translation, as you can see, is here on the screen.
غدوت مريض العقل والدين فالقني لتسمع أنباء الأمور الصحائح فلا تأكلن ما أخرج الماء ظالما ولا تبغي قوتا من غريد الذبائح وأبيض أمات أرادت صريحه لأطفالها دون الغواني الصرائح ولا تفجعن الطير وهي غوافل بما وضعت فالظلم شر القبائح ودع ضرب النحل الذي بكرت له كواسب من أزهار نبت فوائح فما أحرزته كي يكون لغيرها ولا جمعته للندى والمنائح مسحت يدي من كل هذا فليتني أبحت لشأني قبل شيب المسائح بني زمني هل تعلمون سرائرا علمت ولكني بها غير بائح سريتم على غي فهل اهتديتم بما خيرتكم صافيات القرائح وصاح بكم داعي الضلال فما لكم أجبتم على ما خيلت كل صائحي. Thank you very much for listening. Please welcome now Emmy, who's going to read a short statement. Emmy.
Hi everyone, can you hear me through this mic? Perfect. My name's Emmy and I'm a PhD student from McMaster. Before we begin the main discussion this evening, I would first like to thank the organizers for inviting me to come out tonight to offer a land acknowledgement and a brief statement on colonialism and veganism locally in Ontario. The land on which we operate tonight has been a site of human activity for more than 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, and the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Before this territory was impacted by contemporary treaties, the Toronto Purchase and Treaty 13, it was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Ojibwe Allied Nations, and colonial people to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. The Two-Row Wampum is a symbolic record of the first agreement between colonial and Indigenous people in the territory, which dictated that we would live on this land together and respect each other's sovereignty. The Dish with One Spoon is an agreement that recognizes that all inhabitants of this land live off the same resources. It is difficult to share a collective meal together off of a dish with one spoon, hence protocols are put in place to ensure mutual respect, accountability to each other and to the land. Ontario is covered by 46 treaties and other agreements today. Toronto is still home to Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, including Inuit and Métis people. Our intersecting communities are comprised of those native to this land, Indigenous people from other territories, as well as settlers who have come here by choice, force, or otherwise as a result of colonialism and imperialism. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission 94 Calls to Action reaffirms that the treaties with Indigenous peoples must be lawfully honored. We are all treaty peoples and are responsible for honoring and upholding these agreements. Unfortunately, Indigenous peoples in Toronto and across the province of Ontario are still heavily impacted by structural oppression and face individual discrimination, and in some cases, vegans and vegan activists are complicit in this violence or may even be actively and consciously engaged in perpetrating it. Part of the reason that I was asked to speak today is because of my involvement as a vegan in solidarity with Indigenous activists at the Short Hills traditional deer harvests. These traditional sustenance harvests are heavily protested and impeded not only by local settlers with racial prejudice, but also by animal rights activists, and their illegal blockades are upheld by local law enforcement year after year. Most vegan communities in Ontario are led primarily by settlers. Often we fail to recognize the common ground that we share with Indigenous communities that have defended the earth and its inhabitants against destruction and devastation through treaties like the Two-Row and also through traditional cultural practice since long before first contact with colonizers. Settler vegan activists in this region tend to advocate against use or slaughter of animals at any cost, and in doing so we deny the complexity of the relationship between animals and humans, particularly those who shared this land long before we arrived. Intentionally or not, by doing so, we support the colonial agenda of Indigenous assimilation of cultures into Western society. Organizers and supporters of this event that will explore the role that veganwashing plays in the colonial project of Israel aim to adopt an openly socialist and anti-colonial stance as vegans, advocates, and activists. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy. Now I'd like to call John Riddle to talk. He's a socialist activist and historian, best known for translating and publishing historical documents of socialist movement. He is also a longtime activist in the Palestinian Solidarity Movement. John Riddle, everyone.
Well, it's wonderful to be here with you tonight. Now, I was asked to do this on rather short notice, and I was asked to say something about the Palestinian experience, which is odd because I'm not a Palestinian. And so I thought I'd say something about the Canadian experience as it relates to Palestine, and perhaps that might help a bit. There are more than 30,000 Palestinians in Canada, and a very large number of them live, maybe half or so, in the Toronto area. And there are a great many of them who speak in defense of Palestine and do so very eloquently, and fortunately a good number are with us tonight. Now, I think that there is a similarity between the Canadian and the Palestinian experience, which will be obvious to us if we think about the land acknowledgement that has just been given. If you look at a map of Palestine, you see successive shrinkages of the territory still in the possession of the indigenous population. Until now, the land that is still held by Palestinians is like a scattering of pebbles across a big table, just completely dissociated, it's lacking in any coherence or viability. But that is also the Canadian story, how the land was originally held by the indigenous people, and they lost progressively more and more and more of it until all that was left was an archipelago, a string of islands with no viability. And that's the situation that we face when we talk about reconciliation in Canada. Now, the reason this has happened is because of process of settlement. That was said in the acknowledgement too. That is, the people that came to Canada from Europe did not come merely to take the country's wealth and then leave. They came to stay. There are two kinds of colonialism. One colonialism is the arrive and grab variety. That was like in India, where the British stood on top of Indian society, drew out its wealth, and when they had taken as much as they could load on their ships, they left. The other is settler colonialism, and that's what we had in Canada, where the settlers came and took more and took more and took more until finally they had everything. And that's what we've been going through in Israel and Palestine with a great deal of moral support from Canada. Now, the traditional Palestinian society lived for millennia in relative stability as far as its population was concerned. Yes, some populations came and went, but the basic Palestinian society, in terms of the ancestry and traditions and culture of the people, did not change all that much over the centuries. It was marked by a pluralism culturally and religiously, that is, Jewish and Muslim and Christian communities living side by side in relative harmony, without any one group trying to grab the upper hand and take all the possessions of the other. When did that end? Well, the decisive moment was in 1916, when the British government, that then ruled a very large proportion of the world, a third or so, decided that it would set up a colony in Palestine, and it would not be the arrive and grab variety, but the settler variety. And the British government decided that they would choose as their settler force coming into Palestine the Jewish population of Europe that had been driven out of their homes by the endemic and virulent and murderous anti-Jewish hatred that's embedded in the Christian tradition as it existed then and still exists to some extent, if you look carefully at what's in those church scriptural books. And when these settlers arrived in Palestine, it was different from the other peoples that had come from time to time, in the sense that they did not come to integrate into the society, which was so capable of integrating people of different origins, but rather to displace it, to set up its own economy, to take the land. There was a tradition of collective land ownership in Palestine, but that was broken apart and the land was sold to settlers who then took it away from the Palestinian community. There was a lot of resentment and resistance over this project, and the resentment was aimed principally at the British authorities that had set this process in motion, and it culminated in a great uprising of Palestinian people in the late 1930s, and the defeat of that uprising was really the decisive step that opened the doors to taking away the Palestinian homeland. But another key moment was in 1947, when the settler population had succeeded in gaining control over a considerable portion of Palestine, and the United Nations stepped in to try to work out a compromise agreement that would be accepted by everyone. Well, Canada was deeply involved in that. In fact, actually, my family was deeply involved in that. It was a nice sounding formula in theory, but it was not applied in an even-handed way. The territories were divided in a way which gave much more to the settler population than was theirs by right of the size of their population. And when that agreement broke down and the settler population in Palestine grabbed an increased share of the land, finally a ceasefire was arranged, which was the 1948 borders, which gave a large part of Israel to the settlers and reserved other areas for the indigenous population. Now, that 1948 agreement was, Canada has held to it in name ever since. If you look at you can Google it. What's Canada's position on the Palestine-Israeli conflict? You go down the points, they all basically say, go back to the 1938 agreement. And that is actually the international law position on Palestine, as the only position that's ever been covenanted by the United Nations as a whole. The strange thing happened in 1948, and it's actually memorialized in the speech that was given by the Canadian delegate in the United Nations to explain why Palestine should be admitted, why Israel should be admitted to the United Nations. And that was that the United Nations delegate sent to Palestine to work out this deal was assassinated by an extremist settler group. And in reporting this to the United Nations, the Canadian delegate said this is a very regrettable event, and it was to be hoped that the Israeli government, in the fullness of time, would solve the problem of identifying who carried out this crime and bring them to justice. A vain hope, of course, because what we actually saw in the years that followed was the Israeli government progressively going further and further and further and further to step over the boundaries of 1948 and to take, well, now it is pretty much the entirety of Palestine. And in this time, Canada has shifted too, because although the 1948 agreement is still on the books, the actual conduct of the Canadian government, particularly since the Conservative government, and then that was continued under Trudeau, has been to follow every step of the way with the Israeli government in all its violent actions against the indigenous minority. Now, I think that what is happening here is a process of commitment to evil, to the evil actions carried out in Palestine, that is impacting on Canada as well. And I would like to suggest we consider what happened with this meeting tonight. When I saw the advertisement for this meeting, I thought, well, veganism in Palestine, how nice. I thought everyone would welcome this. I thought there would be a large body of supporters of Israel who would come to welcome that they had found common ground.
Dream on.
Instead of that, we saw what actually happened. And in fact, because of this danger, the meetings for Palestine are attacked by gangs of people come to disrupt and destroy the meetings. In Canada, where we have freedom of speech, and this goes on, unless you can haul in the police, something strange is happening in our country, and there's also a campaign on the governmental level to give support to this by declaring that criticism of Israel is hate speech.
Is anti-Semitic.
Not all criticism, but excessive criticism, that is, criticism that strikes home. This is cause for us to think how Canada's errors and vacillations and lack of principle on the Palestine question is infecting Canada itself and placing our own democratic rights in question. And so I would say, go back to that formal position of the Canadian government, the right of the refugees to return, an end to the occupation of Palestinian lands. And a third thing they don't say, but should have said, and that is equal rights for everyone in Israel. In other words, if I could change it from the language of Canadian diplomacy to the language of Palestinian advocacy, let's end Israeli apartheid. That is the solution over there, and it's also the solution for us here. Thank you.
Now, Ahlam Haroun will be joining us via Skype. She is an executive director of the Palestinian Animal League and a longtime feminist and animal activist in the West Bank. Hello, Ahlam. Can you hear us?
Hello.
Oh, there you are.
Thank you very much. I can hear myself. So,
We can hear you. Can you hear us?
my presentation is about the animal rights movement in Palestine through dealing with the case of the Palestinian Animal League, which I lead now as the executive director since May 2018. So, what is PAL? What is the Palestinian Animal League? PAL was established in 2011 as an initiative by local people from a refugee camp in Ramallah called Jalazon Refugee Camp. It is located, as I said, in Ramallah. It's based in the West Bank, the occupied Palestinian territories. The aim actually started to be to seek justice for both animals and people through empowering local people in order to be able to help animals. And by local people, we mean everyone, but particularly children. So what kind of work that PAL started with, it was by thinking about breaking the cycle of violence, the cycle of abuse, through advocating against all forms of oppression, and through emphasizing that we should not allow the occupation to hinder our efforts to build a strong society, a strong Palestinian society, where the powerful side or the powerful people looks after the vulnerable, whether they are people or animals. And where justice for all is number one priority. So, what is PAL doing? I'm sorry, I have a little bit of mess here, but I think it's under control now. Although it's like almost 3 a.m. in the morning.
Oh, wow.
So what PAL is doing, we actually have like, let's say five programs. The first is empowering people to help animals. And we basically work on that through our program, which is the Youth for Change program. We started this program 4 years ago. It includes capacity building activities and providing the space for implementing initiatives initiated by the children and the young people themselves, such as recycling or providing food, water, and shelter for stray animals, mainly during snowstorms or very cold times in winter and during heat waves in summer. On the other hand, in January 2019, we launched the first charity vet clinic in Palestine. Nowadays we have one day every week where people can bring their companion animals for spaying, vaccinations, and treatment at humble fees, and where we provide free of charge service for rescued, injured, and sick animals, stray animals. We encourage people to adopt rescued animals for free veterinary service for the first year. So we actually encourage people to bring those animals in need to be treated at our vet clinic, and we encourage them to adopt these animals and providing and supporting them with free veterinary service for the first year. Nowadays, on like another program, which is about the stray animals, mainly stray dogs, we are having talks nowadays and workshops with the Ministry of Local Governance, the Palestinian Ministry of Local Governance, of course, that is responsible for the municipalities around the Palestinian territories, in order to stop shooting and poisoning stray dogs and adapt ethical alternatives to deal with the increasing number of stray dogs. We also have a program approaching people who have who are dealing with working animals or who have working animals. By the way, they are like most of them, they are poor people, and we sometimes provide vet service for these working animals and make sure that animals are being provided with good nutrition, shelter, and being treated well. Of course, we aim to end any kind of exploitation of animals and usage of animals, but when it comes to the condition in the Palestinian territories, we cannot actually ask poor people to give up on using animals, given their actually the hardship that they are living in. But at least we aim to provide at least a kind of nicer life for these animals. The last thing that I would talk about what PAL is doing, and the most recent program is actually promoting veganism. Although we had the first vegan cafe established in 2016, but our recent activities, not only include getting people to know vegan food, but they also have significant educational and awareness component. We also are working on mapping the vegan-friendly places in the Palestinian territories and encourage restaurants to label the vegan options and to include more of them. In 2 days, we are having the sacrifice Eid, the Al-Eid, and we are actually, last year we published an article about having an alternative for sacrificing animals and find better ways to help poor people. So, animal advocacy under occupation. If we want to summarize what the main points are about what it feel like to be an animal advocate in Palestine under occupation. We are facing different kind of challenges. So, first of all, is the continuous lack of confiscation. For many Palestinians, the failure in protecting the land has basically suspended the fight for human rights and, of course, for animal rights as well. The second thing is the human rights issues. So establishing the inequalities that severely affected human rights in Palestine has made defending animal rights a luxury that most Palestinians cannot afford. we also have like a main issue here in the Palestinian Authorities, which is the term of Area C. Area C is like more than 60% of the land of the West Bank. So, and it's under full Israeli control, administrative and security control. So the deprivation of pasture and preventing Palestinians from grazing their animals near confiscated lands, mainly near Israeli settlements, and confiscated lands to be in more than, like, as I said before, 60% of the occupied Palestinian territories, which means the lack of resources for the Palestinian populations. And by the way, only 1% of the Area C is available for Palestinians to make any kind of construction. So Palestinians are not allowed to use 99% of their lands in Area C without getting Israeli permit, which is of course unlikely to be given. Another challenge that we face as an animal protection organization in Palestine is that some medications and equipment are prohibited for Palestinians to import or acquire. On this regard, for example, PAL previously was denied tranquilizer guns and some other medications because from the occupation's perspective, Palestinians can use these items or these things as weapons against Israelis. So, how to survive and strive as PAL? We are 8 years old now. We have like two main things. The first thing is we apply the theory of change. So we actually identify necessary preconditions that we should consider doing now in order to be able to achieve our long-term goal, which is providing a kinder place for animals in Palestine. And actually by observing short-term results, more people, Palestinian people I mean, will be motivated to join and support PAL. And we can see actually the impact of our activities and our efforts in the Palestinian territories, especially in the past 2 years. We are having more and more people are joining us and joining the movement for providing a better place for animals in Palestine. The second thing is that this is the solidarity and support from international animal rights organizations and activists. And this is actually very important from our point of view because we expect from the international support different things at different levels. And I can summarize that with first of all, that, for example, we would welcome volunteer vets and activists, and we are inviting them to come and help us in our activities with either stray animals or working animals, as well as at PAL's clinic to increase the number of veterinary days per week, because we only have 1 day per week at the moment. The second point is like making some medications and equipment available. The vet clinic needs some vital equipment and tools at the moment. So we established it, but there are a lot of things that need to be made available. The third thing is that to represent PAL at international events and activities as part of our international solidarity groups, because we as Palestinians cannot always get visas and get the financial resources to go outside and represent PAL, so we rely on our solidarity groups to do that. And of course, it is related to the fourth point, which is the fundraising activities. to help us being sustainable and to help our programs to continue. The fifth point is to spread the word on activism under occupation. It's very important, like this kind of event, to be everywhere, to speak more about what it's like to be an activist under occupation, given all the challenges that I actually summarized. The sixth and really significant point here is to support any kind of activity or event or initiative or program that would lead and help to end the occupation for Palestinian land, Palestinian animals, and Palestinian humans. I would say that I summarized what I want to say. I wanted to be very brief. I didn't want to elaborate more things because I could see the program provided by my friends for participating with you now. And I could see that some parts of the things that I would be speaking about already covered in my colleagues' speeches. So thank you very much. And here is our website and our Facebook page and Instagram page for you to follow us and to know more about us and about our work in the Palestinian territories. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce Michael John Adario. He's the editor of Animal Liberation Currents magazine. For more than 20 years, he has been involved in animal rights, activism, socialist organizing, the trade union movement, and the NDP. He has been a shop floor and staff organizer with several unions, including IFPTE, United Steelworkers, and SEIU. He's an organizer with Vegans for BDS.
Okay, I have a lot to get through, and I'm probably going to just do a drive-by on some of these slides without making, without doing too much of explanation, just to cut down partially for time. You might have caught this tweet from the National Security Agency a couple of months ago, just expressing all of their wonderful LGBT workers. If you are unfamiliar with the NSA, you can Google that, and I won't bother helping you. But this is probably a good example of pinkwashing, using LGBT narratives and so on to hide what is in fact a really ugly system. This actually is so, because this is already 2019 and this is so, it's already so normalized, it's maybe not even the best example of pinkwashing, which maybe some of the better examples would have been a few years back. The period coming out of the Second Intifada represented a kind of sea change in Israel's use of propaganda. There is a kind of traditional Hasbara, which has been around for a really long time, but most of it is kind of, especially in the United States, lobbying through organizations like AIPAC and so on. The Second Intifada started to change that, and very early on, the Israeli government started to realize that they were not keeping young, especially young American Jews engaged with Israel. The international perceptions of the state and the regions in general were not very good. Israel is extremely low on international brand indices of various kinds and so on, and they needed something to do about that. So what took place was a joint exercise between a number of basically Wall Street communications, polling, and public relations firms, and three core elements of the Israeli government, namely the Foreign Ministry, the Prime Minister's Office, and the Finance Ministry. I put the tourism ministry there too because a lot of the rollout has taken place through them. And you can see just a few of the, I've listed just a few of the various groups that have participated in the coalition of marketing and communications executives. And these are, Burson Marsteller is one of the largest PR firms on the planet, and so are most of these are other Wall Street firms. These are all American firms, in many cases providing very costly, free polling research very early on in the game. This started very early in the 2000s with about 3 years actually of market research, and in 2005 crystallized with the participation of some of these other groups. Interestingly, as the project got going, it was a really sophisticated endeavor to change perceptions by highlighting some of the the idea that Israel is a forward-thinking, progressive, cutting-edge in culture and that kind of thing. And they did plenty of test marketing over the years and niche marketing to different segments. The program, by the time the market research was completed, the very first niche market group, in fact, was young Jewish males in the United States, 18 to 32 or something like that, that general, classic young demographic. And this is a cover of Maxim magazine, that August publication of men's feminist allyship. And they did a spotlight in 2006 on women in the Israel Defense Forces. And that, of course, is Gal Gadot. She was already a popular model and actress in Tel Aviv before she found global fame as Wonder Woman. And this was actually the very first sort of public parties initiated by the project Brand Israel. And so it got off to a little bit of a cumbersome start, but it has really picked up in its effectiveness. And that was already, it took some speedy turns over the first few years. So in 2008, the campaign did a huge rollout of test marketing in various cities around the world, including New York, Boston, Toronto, London, Tokyo, and a bunch of others, one of which resulted in the Spotlight Tel Aviv at the Toronto International Film Festival in 2008. You might remember John Grayson. If any of you remember that period, it was very controversial. The filmmaker John Grayson actually pulled out of the film festival, and there was a big resulting controversy, which also resulted in this ridiculous front page spread in the Toronto Star. What is really novel about these campaigns started to occur in 2009, when Brand Israel started appropriating and piggybacking on elements of progressive social movements to wash crimes of occupation. The very first group that they turned to was young gay men. And in 2009, the Israeli government sponsored a gay Olympics delegation, and they arranged to have the International Gay and Lesbian Travel Association host a major conference in Tel Aviv. In the following couple of years, 2010 there, they sponsored an Israeli Pride Month in San Francisco, which is really interesting. There's no grassroots Israeli Pride group in San Francisco. This was a top-down, organized by Brand Israel. And the Ministry of Tourism in Tel Aviv Tourism Board and the Aguda, I think I'm pronouncing that right, Israel's largest LGBT organization, launched a program called Tel Aviv Gay Vibe. And the Tourism Ministry in Tel Aviv municipality supplied a whopping $94 million, which is a really significant amount of money then, in order to start attracting an international gay audience to the supposed gay splendor that is Tel Aviv. So that is really a quick overview of some of the pinkwashing that was conducted by Brand Israel. But pinkwashing, of course, does hide some pretty noxious realities. The fact is, Israeli society is actually a very conservative, very strongly fundamentalist society. There's intense homophobia. There are certainly pockets in Tel Aviv that is, that's reasonable for gay and lesbian people to have a great time, but generally speaking, it's quite conservative. For example, September 2017, the Knesset actually voted down gay marriage. There is still a gay blood ban. There's still gay conversion therapy. And especially for Palestinians and Arab Israelis, it's much, much worse. In particular, gay men are often blackmailed into spying for Israel. Non-Israelis of any description are subject, of course, to intense anti-Arab racism. Arab Israeli LGBT are often blackmailed even into joining the IDF. And the recognition of same-sex unions is only there as long as one is Jewish, and at least one is Jewish, and the union itself was made outside of Israel, not within. So the reality is it's not the gay splendor that Brand Israel has tried to create with these kinds of programs. Now the same also happens in the world of ecology and environmentalism. I won't play this for you, but you can actually find some of these sorts of things on the internet. This was a series of commercials that the Brand Israel campaign sponsored in 2012 in the lead up to the Rio +20 Summit on Sustainable Development. And this was actually the very first ever global television campaign to brand Israel as a green country. And there's a few more examples there, but I'll skip a little bit past them. But I'm pretty sure everyone knows what pink washing and green washing amount to. So actually I should just touch on the environmental thing a little bit. The reality for so-called environmentalism in Israel is quite horrific if you are Palestinian. In particular, what this is a picture from a 2005 article in Mondoweiss of a farm next to an industry called Gashuri and Sons, which doesn't have a functional sewage system. The waste seeps out from under a brick wall that lines the industrial zone where it's housed, and then it spills out into, in this particular case, an organic banana farm that's owned by a Palestinian family. This kind of toxic stream should be taken through Israeli sewers, but you can see the separation or annexation wall in the background there. That's not going to happen. These industrial zones are expansive. There are almost 200 of them across the West Bank, and they are collections of major, highly polluting industries, and the construction of them is such that land and the further ability to construct larger settlements is guaranteed, and that chokes off the ability for Palestinian farmers to do their work. It chokes off the ability for Palestinians to own land and shrinks the available land holdings for Palestinians even further. This is on top of, an industrial zone, like I said, is a highly concentrated, polluting industry. This particular industry, Gashuri, moved over the Green Line into Tulkarim from Netanya, just a few miles away in the mid-'80s after a court case declared it an environmental hazard. And since that time, because the winds blow in a westerly direction into Israel at certain times of the year, this site actually shuts down for a whole month to avoid blowing pollutants into Green Line Israel. That's the reality for many Palestinians. No one should get away with a quick mention of the Jewish National Fund, especially as there's an important campaign here in Canada to have the charitable status sort of delisted. There's such a wealth of information on the JNF. I just encourage everyone to kind of examine that for themselves. I just want to quickly speed along here. Incidentally, how many people have heard the terms pink washing and green washing as they actually apply to the Palestinian freedom struggle? Okay, not bad. How many people have actually heard the term vegan washing at all? Whether or not it's, oh, that's interesting too. Okay, well, I'm going to skip through a bunch of slides. Sorry if I'm putting silly ideas into your head. And I didn't have time to cut some of this down. So in December 2015, this is the YouTube channel of the State of Israel, and it is a video proclaiming all of the wondrous vegan options and degrees of veganism throughout Israel, and especially Tel Aviv. These started appearing in 2015. as veganism was increasing in popularity like it was everywhere else in the West in the early 2000s especially. And there is a couple of them that have appeared over the years. It's very common to hear that phrase, vegan capital of the world. So this particular one, again, the state social media channel has put out a few of these over the years. This one is more recent from November 2018, saying the same thing. So this has a long lineage that is a little bit difficult to trace. It is true that veganism is, increasing in a lot of places, but it's not true everywhere that the state-run institutions and government institutions are proclaiming it as loudly as Israel. And the reason for that is, again, this is a brand Israel type of move to highlight the most progressive elements of Israeli society in order to detract from the occupation. And this is a very special case. This is, in fact, the IDF who, in addition to administering the occupation, makes much of the fact that it has a number of vegan soldiers. And if you are vegan in the IDF, you can get a special supplement, monetary supplement for rations. You can get a non-wool beret, and you can get non-leather vegan boots, so you can do your work. And this is the Israeli Defense Forces Twitter account claiming that they have 10,000 vegan soldiers. That is not really true, but they do have vegan soldiers, but not quite that many, and I'm not sure in the end it really matters. So, but the Brand Israel campaign, like with these kinds of things, like the IDF and some of the state social media channels, that it's not quite as overt. It hasn't been quite as overt in Brand Israel marketing until 2018. So, admittedly, this is quite late in the game for Brand Israel, but this particular case is quite interesting. There is a very slick marketing firm called Vibe Israel, and it is distinguished by being one of the very first organizations to capitalize profoundly on this idea of social media influencers and running these kinds of specialized junket trips for them to be able to promote their experience on a guided tour of the company. Now, this being 2019, we've had this idea of social media influencers for a very long time, quite annoyingly in many cases, in fact, but in the late 2000s, I mean, YouTube had only been around for a handful of years, and this idea of genuine social media influencers, the people who can command tremendous audiences on their channels over selected social media, was still a fairly new phenomena. And Brand Israel was one of the very first to take a super advantage of them. Now, Vibe Israel has been around in one form or another since I think 2008 or 2009 and started running these tours I think in 2011. And they've cut across, as you would expect, the whole set of Brand Israel objectives. They take slivers of fascinating and exciting elements of society and bring influencers who are commercially invested or culturally invested in these kinds of elements. So you get things like architecture tours, wine tasting tours, there's wellness tours, it runs the gamut. In 2018, they ran a vegan culinary tour of Israel, primarily focused in Tel Aviv and a few other places. So I just want to describe this a little bit. This particular, the tours that Vibe Israel runs are typically quite seriously managed. The number of folks typically on one of these tours is in the range of 4 to 6, and it comes with support staff and people able to help draft and film video and other elements of production, and they go on an 8 to 10 day tour. The founder of Brand Israel, in fact, Joanna Landau, likens what Vibe Israel does to a birthright tour for non-Jews. Same sort of thing. You're given a special selection. You're specially selected based on certain criteria. There's lots of background checks to make sure that your commitment to marketing is effective enough that you're not going to raise any silly questions about, the wondrous world you're about to experience for 1 to 2 weeks. So the Vibe Vegan tour happened in March of last year, 2018, and there were 4 people on this particular tour. One of whom is a Canadian from Quebec. He goes by the Buddhist chef, even though he's lily white. And there is a woman, Caitlin Shoemaker. This is her blog called From My Bowl. She's American, and it's mostly like a recipe kind of blog. This person is from the UK, and this is called Rebel Recipes. And if you'll notice, I'm not sure if you can read that, I call my blog Rebel Recipes because it's all about the non-conformity. She adds a crucial level of street credibility to this particular affair. And the last person is Sweet Simple Vegan. Can't remember the actual name. Interestingly, a lot of these, they are vegan, but some of these people had only been vegan for a handful of years before they landed one of these tours. So whatever particular attributes, they obviously had the particular attributes that Brand Israel was looking for, and obviously in some cases it wasn't necessarily the length of time that they were vegan or their commitment to animal liberation or anything of the sort. So, so this is, I think, the Buddhist chef. Again, this video is fairly lengthy, so I won't. I'll just keep the sound off while I chat. But you can kind of get the the so-called vibe, as it were, of what's going on here. They're brought to particular places in Tel Aviv and different spots around Israel. All vegan restaurants, a farm sanctuary, this sort of thing, all designed to make it look like Israel is this wondrous vegan destination. The video was also posted on his Facebook page with the title "Israel, World's Top Vegan Destination." This is that Buddhist chef guy. Now, the tours are really quite strictly managed, not overly strictly managed, so that it is obvious you're being given the guided tour. But the Palestinian Animal League did get word that this was happening and actually reached out to this Buddhist chef to come to Palestine, and he refused due to scheduling, which is probably not a lie because there is some scheduling that is involved. But in no time ever since that tour, which has been a year and a half, has he actually engaged with the Palestinian Animal League. He's never returned to visit the West Bank, much less Gaza. The Animal League actually was, or friends of the Animal League, I suppose, were able to grab some screenshots of some interactions with Palestinian supporters, calling him out for this kind of egregious vegan washing. You'll need to take careful look at some of the kinds of comments. This screenshot is of posts in support of his tour, but you'll need to take careful look. The very first contributor at the top writes, "Israel is a global center for veganism, and besides for the traditional Israeli food, there are amazing vegan restaurants of all types." Scroll down a little bit to someone else named Karen. "Israel is a global center for veganism, and besides for the traditional Israeli food, there are amazing vegan restaurants of all types." Raphael writes, "Israel is a global center of veganism." Rotem writes, "Israel is a global center for veganism." So this is organized Hasbara, which in the most recent years has reached an enormous level of sophistication. There are multiple agencies, for example, the IDF New Media Desk. This is a outfit that is operated by the IDF that employs thousands of people on a full and part-time basis to seek out social media conflicts where support for Palestine is raised and neutralize them. And by neutralize, we mean hurling accusations of anti-Semitism, this kind of repetitive, in this case, Israel is the global center for veganism, and so on and so on and so on. That is really significant. And Vibe Israel kind of gets de facto support in that way because it's not an accidental flare-up. They're running a pro-Israel outfit and they get de facto surveilled support from Hasbara organizations. And there are a lot more of them than the IDF New Media Desk. I can't remember the name, somebody might remember, but it literally just a few months ago, a massive new one was launched by the Israeli government. So that's some pretty serious stuff. I'm putting this particular shot of up on the screen. This is again from the Vibe Israel website in the testimonials section. Caitlin Shoemaker is notable here because if you're really interested, you can scroll back through a year and a half of her Instagram posts and find the place during the tour. She seems to have been a little bit more genuinely naive about what the experience was actually doing with her participation. She did actually leave a lot of comments up, and she didn't block many people or fight back in any significant way. On the other hand, this is the landing page from the testimonial section in Vibe Vegan, and she's one of the two main things, so that's really kind of unfortunate. So this had an enormous amount of impact. You don't get to go on a Vibe tour without having hundreds of thousands of followers and the ability to create that kind of impressions, a number of impressions across social media. I can't remember the actual title, but or the actual number for between each of the four, but I think I added them up to over 1 million between all four. Was the social media impact of this particular tour, and that's pretty significant, and that is part of how over the last few years that this idea of Israel as a vegan haven of whatever sort has really become this popular misconception. Now, Vibe Israel, I should mention too. Because it is a major brand Israel outfit, it actually has an aura of being like a kind of civic organization and one that's really independent. But the founder, Joanna Landau, is actually a brand Israel executive in the United States. And everything that an organization like Brand Israel does has an imprint on the wider marketing, tourism, and communications landscape for Israel. So these vegan culinary tours have become kind of all the rage, even just in the last year. This is just a sampling of a few of them that you can take. This one is like an 8 or 10 day tour they have options for, and there's many more. If you Google vegan tours Israel, you're going to get some pages to scroll through, and you'll have lots of options. So this is the OEC data from 2018. And we'll hone in a little bit more directly on that graph. So if you are not able to see, this is Israel right here. Number four all over, all around in terms of meat consumption. The X at the top is chicken. They are far and away the leading consumer of chicken products. The next one is beef and veal. They are also clearly one of the leaders all around. And the third one down, these squares are sheep meat consumption. There's obviously no pork, but this little mark here, they're hard to see, but they're in the top 15 of sheep meat. So all around this idea of Israel being a vegan haven, you'd have to have a pretty strange definition of what veganism is. If it's just the number of vegan restaurants in your city, I don't know what to say. Most people who eat at vegan restaurants are not vegan. Like having an option available for people to choose from in a marketplace is not an indication of veganism. The fact remains, Israel is a top, by a large margin, consumer of animal products. And the idea that veganism is this widespread phenomena is just simply factually false. There are other things that hide this idea of Israel as being a vegan haven. There's this popular statistic that went around for a few years of something like 5% of Israelis claim veganism. And occasionally you will hear that still being repeated, and that again is false. Israel's own Central Bureau of Statistics in 2016 showed about 1.7% vegans and a little under 5% vegetarians. And the question posed on the official survey was self-selected, so it didn't necessarily even define what veganism is. And if you know many vegans, some people have a very loose definition of what veganism is. So again, even what is actually a low statistic is probably skewed even lower. Israel for animals is, not a very nice place on a number of other statistics. There is a tremendous amount of vivisection that is practiced in Israel, and the guidelines for pain management are amongst the worst in the world, and high level of pain experiments are more regular than not across Israel. So that's a pretty significant indication of not being much of a vegan haven. There's also a large animal trafficking network through Jordan and so on, and there's quite a few more stats if you're interested. The live trade, Israel is a major destination for live export and so on. So we can take a very quick kind of scan through some of the, at least the highlights of how veganism has become supposedly all the rage. One that keeps getting mentioned is this Tal Gboa, who is an animal activist, and she was on the Israeli version of Big Brother, which is apparently one of the top-rated shows in Israel, and she won the program, and there are apparently quite a number of episodes where she has quite aggressively, gone after some of her. Is it housemates? I don't watch this show really, so for being vegan, and there's episodes of big cry-ins and that kind of thing, people pledging to change their diet and all that kind of stuff. So there's also Meatless Mondays, which was instigated by another TV celebrity, Miki Hamovich. If I'm pronouncing that wrong, I apologize, who led the Meatless Monday campaign in Israel. And it was apparently a big deal when the Knesset started a Meatless Mondays campaign, which in essence was simply adding a couple of more vegetarian options to the menu. It wasn't actually a full Meatless Mondays. It was like if you happened to be a vegetarian on that day in the legislature, you could, grab your meal and not feel too bad about it. And this was going on in 2013. And this is interesting because Netanyahu has actually responded positively to this idea that, he's touched by some of these claims, and this whole exercise for a time started to become this preposterous setup of making the Israeli prime minister some poster boy for vegetarianism, which is just utterly absurd. And if any of you have not encountered this individual yet, there is no discussion of animal rights in Israel that can happen without reference to this guy. This is Gary Yourofsky. He is an American. I'm really just not going to mince words. He is an absolutely noxious individual. He is absolutely chock full of just blustering male aggression. And he has that famous YouTube video, the greatest video you will ever see, the greatest speech you will ever see, which is the greatest nonsense I've ever heard. There is nothing particularly unique about it. If you watch even the first few minutes of the video, if you can get through it, it's a speech at some university in the US where he is basically just going to impart his knowledge to everyone, and it's a great big setup to look out, your life is going to change. I'm not sure that that kind of approach and strategy is really one that is constitutes much of an education. But in any case, that particular speech was translated into Hebrew and is circulated around Israel. And it's actually quite amazing how much reference this guy actually does get, both inside and without outside Israel. He retired, retired is the operative word here because this whole exercise for him over the last dozen years has pretty much been a career. He retired, I think, in 2016, claiming burnout, which, given his approach, is surprising he lasted even that long. But what is particularly noxious about his viewpoints is that he is an absolutely resolute Zionist. Even if he doesn't come out, he kind of does, but often will just sort of sugarcoat the idea, mostly by diverting into an explanation of how he is some worse ism. So he's called himself, no, I'm not a racist, I'm just a fucking misanthropist or something like that. So this is not really a good strategy. But in Israel, because I do want to make a quick point about all of this rise in veganism. The rise in veganism, both inside and outside Israel, like right across the West, in part of this is actually real, but it's becoming ever so less connected to actual animal liberation struggle. And in fact, you cannot have this degree of popularity for something called veganism, and precisely unless it is utterly detached from an actual politics. Most of what we experience in terms of the discourse around veganism is a lifestyle choice, or it's some sort of identity and that kind of thing. It's extraordinary the level and the manner in which politics has just been entirely hollowed out of veganism. And that is really, really alarming. I can share with you, I've been vegan I'm into my 30th year. I went vegan in 1990. That period, it's important to note, was a much more contentious one in the animal rights world, where certain fissures were really starting to open up in the animal liberation world. That is not happening anymore. And I can tell you from personal experience that even people on both sides of that fissure, we refer to it mostly these days as welfarism and abolitionism, nobody would have predicted the level, even if you were dyed in the wool, as it were, welfarist, that veganism, as we are experiencing it in this particular era, would become so detached from an actual movement politics. So what Yurovsky has really been offering, especially to Israelis, is a way to claim an identity and claim a kind of either some sort of cultural element about themselves, or a kind of just strictly diet, but infuse it with a kind of ethics behind it, which is kind of common, but this particular ethics is profoundly anti-Palestinianism. I'm not going to play this. You can see the link there if you want to get through that. After being charged with anti-Palestinianism, he doubled down in this particular video, doubling down on, as you can see, Palestinians, but blacks and all kinds of other so-called hypocrites. And it's just vile. But that is an important element to the story of the so-called, whatever level really is happening in Israel, and I don't think it's ever really amounted to much. Part of that is the story, and that's really important. That is called vegan washing. So now, vegan, I'm going to skip through a few things. What I did want to mention a couple of things about the way that this, actually I should maybe just do this quickly. This notion of Israel as a vegan haven has actually been picked up by a lot of people and institutions that don't really have a lot to do with veganism or vegetarianism. And one problematic one is this guy, Nas Daily. Now, Nisar Yassin, he's in his late 20s. He's a young Arab Israeli, and that's really important to this story. He's Harvard educated. He travels on an Israeli passport, and he was earning a six-figure income at a tech firm before he launched this series of one-minute videos called Nas Daily. And it's basically a minute of some interesting factoid in his endless world travels. He's continuing to make a lot of money at this and has apparently a goal of reaching $1 million in wealth by the time he's 30. But for a lot of people, he is a really problematic figure because he puts this normalizing salve, which on the occupation and Arab-Israeli relations in general, precisely using his Arab-Israeli identity.
But I have finally arrived to my home in Israel. But every time I mention the word Israel or Palestine, I get in trouble in the comment section. There is no Israel, you piece of f***ing. There is no Palestine, you So to settle this issue, here is where I stand. I am a Palestinian Israeli. 69 years ago, when Israel came into existence, some Palestinians left, some got killed, and some stayed in their lands. My people stayed, and for the next 70 years, we lived under Israel. There are two ways I can live my life. One, I say Israel does not exist and I come only from Palestine. Or two, I accept the borders of Israel and I accept the new borders of Palestine and I move on. I choose number two, to move on. Because in life there are better and bigger things to focus on than the name of a piece of land. There is an Israel and there is a Palestine. I grew up in Israel, right next to Palestine, and I'm jet lagged.
That's that. Now, the McGill Arab Students Network invited Nas Daily to McGill last October, and the McGill Students in Solidarity for Palestine, or Palestinian Human Rights, really strongly objected to this, and there was a little bit of a kerfuffle over his attendance, which I think was a very good thing. But for us in the animal movement concerned about Palestine, Nas has flirted with promoting these kinds of vegan notions. Yeah, and he's talking about Tel Aviv, of course. There was that one. And there's also apparently this vegan village in somewhere in Israel. So actually, I will stop with the slides right there. So this sort of expression has actually traveled all really far and wide. And it has not been possible without a particular set of objectives put forward by Brand Israel to take these kinds of elements of so-called progressive, exciting aspects of Israeli society and pump them way beyond the reality and sort of wash other crimes. And when it's done with social movements like this, it's not just feeding perceptions into like the quote-unquote general population. Very specifically, what these kinds of things these things try to do is to neutralize progressive constituencies, neutralize people who are active, engaged, and liable to be asking the wrong questions. And that is the real achievement of propaganda. And given the level that we have seen in the last 5 years around veganism with reference to Israel has simply been astonishing. Now, in 2009, when Israel started to target the LGBT community, the LGBT community reacted almost immediately. When that Tel Aviv conference happened in 2009 or 2010, the largest LGBT organization in Lebanon immediately called for a boycott, and it kind of grew from there. But there was hardly any space between the initiation of these kinds of campaigns in the LGBT movement and a political response. It has now been, this is getting close to 5 years where veganism has been on the radar as something that has been increasingly weaponized by the Israeli state, and there hasn't been a peep from animal activists. We need to take a very strong stand against this kind of thing being done in the name of the animal movement, and it's about time we started doing that now.
Thank you, Michael. Now I give you, last but certainly not least, Danielle Williams. She's a composer and music educator who taught for 2 years in Ramallah. During that time, she was an active volunteer with the Palestinian Animal League, PAL, and helped organize the first International Solidarity Conference for PAL. She's an organizer with Vegans for BDS. I give you Danielle.
Thank you, everyone. I know it's getting late and that everyone's brain is perhaps filled to the brim already. We'll go through this very briefly, but I think that this is at the heart of what we need to do going forward. We're talking about BDS, which I believe many people here understand and know, and of course there is much to the history and much to the context of what BDS is. But what we're talking about, the acronym boycott, divest, and sanctions. Boycotting products made in Israel that are benefiting from the occupation and companies that are benefiting from the occupation. Divesting is calling on institutions to remove their investments that also come from the illegal Israeli settlements and that benefit from the Israeli occupation. And sanctions are calling on our government to acknowledge and respect that which has been deemed international legal restrictions on Israel and the green line and these sort of things from 1948, which we heard at the beginning. BDS was started 13 years ago. This is a nonviolent form of protest, and it was started by Palestinians in 2005. This is 1 year after the wall, which is behind this man here, the annexation wall and apartheid wall in Israel. It was deemed illegal by the United Nations 1 year in 2005, I believe, and 2004, thank you, and then BDS was established in 2005, 1 year later. This heralds from a long history in Palestine of nonviolent action and protest and boycotting of Israeli goods, particularly in the first Intifada at the end of the 80s, when Palestinians said, no, we will not buy the Israeli products. And there are documentaries or films documenting this work and this form of protest that Palestinians took. It also heralds and draws inspiration from the movements in South Africa, apartheid, international global protests and boycotting that took place in institutions, churches, universities. We know many, many institutions, and this had an extreme effect on ending the apartheid in South Africa. We've seen how pinkwashing, and this campaign against pinkwashing has taken tremendous success in drawing the attention to the ways that the occupation is normalized. And this is a foundation that we as animal rights activists have a responsibility to rise to that bar that has been set by the LGBTQ community and speak out against. One example, there are a number of examples of BDS successes, and one of them that is specifically attributed to the Palestine Animal League, you may or may not know, but these kinds of German Shepherds are used often by the IDF forces to attack Palestinians on their land and their olive groves, any protesters and demonstrators, so it's often used. And this Dutch company that was providing the puppies to the IDF became aware that their dogs were used for this, and the Palestinian Animal League, this was one of their first widely successful campaigns that the Dutch company actually stopped selling the dogs to the IDF. So that is one example of how BDS has particularly been relevant in the animal rights issues. Zionism and international animal rights. So I think most of us can understand when violence is carried out in the name of something that we attribute to be promoting justice, humaneness, ethical treatment of living beings, for me, that's a huge hypocrisy, and it makes me extremely angry. My mother is Christian. In the church, when we have Catholic priests that are doing horrific things, it is our responsibility to call them out. My father's family is Jewish. We have many Jewish leaders who have spoken out against Zionism and the apartheid and the occupation. When we have people carrying out heinous acts in the name of any religion, we call it out and we say, this is not me. And so as vegans, I feel that it's my responsibility to say, no, you will not carry out something that is horrific, that is contributing to a culture of hate that is hurting the environment, the land, and the people. You will not do that in the name of veganism, because for me, that is not what veganism represents. We see this normalization significantly in animal rights. This is a blogger, and I apologize, she has requested to remain anonymous, but she spent time in Palestine, and in her blog she said, it should be emphasized that there are many vegans who are strongly opposed to any form of oppression. For such individuals, veganism is not a substitute for struggling against the oppression of human beings, but is a part and parcel of that struggle. What we see in mainstream animal rights communities like PETA, I went to their website, and the very first page talks about ending speciesism. And in the same website, they completely normalize Israel. They say a Middle Eastern nation as having some of the largest animal rights marches and rallies, animal liberating organizations, first ever cruelty-free vegan cryptocurrency called the vegan coin. Like humans, all other animal values their lives, want to live. So we're comparing it to humans and at the same time normalizing the suffering that is going on just on the other side of the wall. We also have social media, celebrities like the vegan couple that part of their tour this year included Israel. This is another example of both being complicit and to normalizing the occupation. Last year, I represented the Palestine Animal League at the U.S. National Animal Rights Conference, and it was really startling to me to see how much Zionism and Israeli activists were there, and it did create a space for very interesting conversations. Most of the conversations were very civil and were, but of course, we did come to a point often where there were differences, where they said, the idea around the Israeli right to exist, this is a big topic, and there were only one or two really belligerent people who felt that just by having the Palestine Animal League there, it was a political action. And this kind of refers back to what Michael was talking about, of this fear of it becoming a political issue, that animal rights are somehow separate and should remain separate from any political conversation. An article in Haaretz that, excuse me, I'd like to quote. Eyal Gross says in this article, Vegans for and Against the Occupation, in Tel Aviv today, it's far easier to find food whose preparation has not involved the exploitation of animals than to find food whose production has not entailed the oppression and uprooting of other human beings. Veganism is not a substitute for human rights. So what are we doing as Vegans for BDS? This was, Vegans for BDS came about, really has been growing in the last year after the Palestine Animal League, when we organized the first International Animal Rights Conference last year in Palestine. And from that, there were many solidarity partners. We're now in Canada, US, Brazil, Spain, Italy, Australia, and we're growing, and it's really grown as a movement and a conversation globally over the past year. What we do, the kinds of activities represent and speak about vegan washing at animal rights events. There are vegan tours in Palestine, so if you want to go and see the kind of vegan activism that's going on in Palestine, there is this, and could perhaps be an alternate or an opposition maybe even to the vegan birthright tours. Several documents that we are calling on vegan companies as an international solidarity to join us in Vegans for BDS. So it states in one paragraph, we vegans, environmentalists, advocates for human and animal rights, stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people, recognizing that the Israeli occupation of Palestine harms the land, people, and animals there every day. As a key player in this community's vegan food commerce, we request that you and your business consider joining our movement to boycott, divest, and sanction Israeli products. In an age where Israel continues to enforce severe and discriminatory restrictions on Palestinians' human rights, restrict the movement and goods into and out of the West Bank and Gaza, and facilitate the unlawful transfer of Israeli citizens to settlements in the occupied West Bank, we ask you to join us in calling out that the occupation is not vegan. We ask you to join us in this effort to be the voice for both Palestinians, vegan animal rights activists who wish to fight for a more just and ethical world. And so we hope that you'll be a part of joining us in this movement. Thank you.
All right, I want to thank everyone for attending tonight. With the late start, we've pushed 2 hours tonight, so we will